Welcome to the Mydylarama podcast. Thanks for joining us again. This time we're having a bit of a novelty. We have a guest. Well, actually, I'll let George introduce himself. So I'm Abla. I'm a film programmer. George, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, Abla, and thanks for having me on. I know this has been a few weeks in the making now, and been really enjoying the podcast thus far. So I'm also a film programmer, although I've got a few other hats. I am a lecturer in film studies, and I am also the co-founder and festival producer of the Japanese Avant-Garde and Experimental Film Festival.
Great, thank you very much. And my co-host Coco Green is still there.
Hello.
Hello. So I'll start briefly. As usual, we'll have an intro where we talk about our picks of the week, and then we'll crack on and talk about Black is King. So very briefly, last week I talked about season 1 of The Sinner on Netflix, and I've been watching season 2, and the only reason I'm mentioning this is because season 1 of The Sinner made us discuss something that we'd been previously discussing, which was the expediency of treating cases in various police departments across the US where they would pin a number of crimes on one person. It's based on a child who commits a crime, like the previous season, which is where a seemingly very innocent person, which is a young mum, commits a crime. This child comes from a cult. And the previous time we were talking about cults. So if you want to hear more about what we had to say and what the difference, the fine line or thick line between cults and religions is, you can just listen to the previous podcast.
I don't know if we were ever definitive on that. I think we had some ideas.
We weren't. You concluded that a cult is a new religion.
Oh, yes. Well, yeah, but that's the definition, is a cult's new religion.
It's the definition, but I made the point that a cult is culturally isolated, if that makes sense. So a cult very much operates in isolation of the rest of society, and its own system of beliefs isn't embedded in society. So, for example, very briefly, say a so-called secular state like France, its calendar is based on Catholicism, it's based on Christianity. Most of its rituals and its the way its society is structured, all of those things are based on Christianity, whereas none of these are based on, say, the Temple du Soleil or any of its cults. Do you see what I mean? They operate within their own systems of rituals and beliefs that aren't really connected to anything else. And I want to say this because I thought of it after we finished the podcast. I was like, oh, I should have said this intelligent sounding thing, and I didn't. So I wanted to shoehorn it in this week.
Oh,
so thank you for that, giving me this little platform. Moving on from The Sinner, finally, I'm going to talk about the festivals first because I also want to talk about another film that will allow me to segue more easily and more elegantly into our main subject. So I mentioned previously the Iraqi Independent Film Festival that's going to be online and free to watch from the 21st to the 28th of August. The program is now live, so you can see this on their Instagram page. They have a really nice selection of films, talks, etc. There's a women filmmakers program, etc. Another one that I'd like to flag has been recommended by a film magazine, which is the Film Fest Report, which, just an aside, it's a really good tool for programmers and festival directors because it's a new magazine that lists and covers most of the worldwide film festivals. Anyway, Film Fest Report recommend the International Film Festival in Cologne. Anyway, that's going to be the first edition of that festival. The second reason, the award selection is quite eclectic. So they've got an award for Best Music Video, for Best Web Series. And that will take place from the 11th to 12th of September. And it's going to be venue-based, so that there's an after-party, so I'm not sure how that will happen. And then online for free again is the London Kurdish Film Festival, currently running from the 15th to 24th of August. And it's very, very rich in content and diversity, as there are I think about 50 screenings, and it's very nicely curated. So they have various themes. They've got women in films. They've got the rather more depressing war on screen. I think they've got children on film. And looking at their website, it's very, very slick and well put together. And it's a very comprehensive website. So you just go on the picture of the film and it just takes you to a YouTube link to watch it. So you can have a lot of fun with that. What would you recommend, George?
let's go to Australia. So I went 4 days short of 6 months. I went to a real cinema for the first time since lockdown, and I saw Shannon Murphy's Babyteeth. So debut film from Shannon Murphy, set in Sydney. Eliza Scanlon, she plays a 16-year-old girl with cancer. It starts with her having this kind of crash meet cute moment with a really scuzzy, yet really good-looking guy played by Toby Wallace, who's kind of, imagine an Australian. It's kind of if Sheila Burf was Australian, is the kind of character he would play. And actually, it's not that dissimilar from the start of like American Honey, for example, where a young woman meets this kind of slightly shady, slightly dodgy, but quite attractive in dangerous ways man, and decides that, well, actually, my life as I'm living it is not really up to much, or it's not satisfying. And she kind of takes a kind of left turn in life from that point. It's a really, really weird film. It keeps taking these left turns. It keeps subverting your expectations. There's little narratives seem to be bubbling up, very cliched narrative pathways, which then just don't pan out. It's massively elliptical. There's huge time jumps between scenes, which is quite unusual, I think, in Western filmmaking, certainly in mainstream filmmaking. It's suggested perhaps later on that the scenes aren't necessarily playing out in chronological order, although that's quite hard to establish. So her parents, played by Essie Davis, who I know from The Babadook, she's the mum in that, she's very good. Ben Mendelsohn, who's in just about everything now, as far as I can tell, every sort of major Hollywood film. And there's this incorporation of like the cuckoo in the nest, as this character, Toby Wallace's character Moses, becomes more insidiously incorporated into this family unit. And the family unit becomes very strange and unconventional. I was actually reminded in a way of something like Yorgos Lanthimos's Dogtooth. The kind of cuckoo coming into the family and changing the dynamics massively, I think probably goes back to Pasolini theorem, sort of political filmmaking back in the, I think 1970 that film is, or late 60s. And then it's been redone like in a more lo-fi way by people like Takeshi Miike, Visitor Q. The house is very modernist and very strange. That idea actually reminded me of something like Parasite even. So there's this very offbeat tonal aspect to the film. And there's a point in the middle of the film where the characters' parents, so Essie Davis and Ben Mendelsohn, they have to basically make a decision. Are they going to accept all the craziness that's going on in their daughter's life, or are they going to kind of sort of put their foot down and say, no, this is ridiculous? And almost, I think the audience has to make that same decision. Are you going to go with the film? Are you going to follow it and just say, okay, look, I'm just going to let this carry me along? Or I can imagine people being quite resistant to that as well. So I would definitely recommend it, but I can't guarantee that you would like it.
So what drew you to it?
I think it's the first film out in cinemas there haven't been many films out that's had anything like a good review, probably. I was just keen to go back and see something. And it was quite a weird experience going through the cinema. Once I was in my seat, it was fine. There were actually more people in the cinema than I had anticipated. I thought it'd be completely empty.
Oh, well, that's heartening. From Australia, we zoom back to the US, and I would like to mention a film that I saw yesterday, incidentally, which is the Richard Pryor documentary from 2013. And it's called Richard Pryor, Omit The Logic, and it's now on Sky. And I really enjoyed that because I've always been a bit of a fan of Richard Pryor's both films and stand-up. And I didn't really know much about his life. I knew he suffered from depression and drug abuse. It's nothing groundbreaking. It's the usual talking heads. They've got Robin Williams, they've got Whoopi Goldberg and so on talking about him. I would definitely recommend it if you're interested in Richard Pryor's life. There wasn't enough about, I think, his his early career, I would have liked to find out more about how he got into films, how he got into stand-up and so on. I would have liked a bit more about that. But overall, it's a really good documentary. But the reason I mention it specifically here is because there's a bit where apparently he goes to Africa to find his roots. And one of the talking heads, I think it's one of his ex-wives, who says he had a bit of an identity crisis and he felt that he needed to go back to Africa, to his origins and so on. And that's what I think is worth tying into Black is King, and incidentally what we were talking about last time in the context of American Horror Story, where we talked about voodoo and about how a lot of Black Americans are experiencing this identity crisis in regards to tracing back somewhat mythical history to Africa.
Which I critique, because I certainly think it's problematic.
Exactly, but that's why I bring it up. And what's interesting is that when they talk about Richard Pryor, he just goes back to Africa. There's no mention of what country he goes to, what city he goes to.
Hence the problem. That's how it always is. People pick a country. I saw this rapper once on social media talking about Ghana, and he'd gone on a trip. And I'm really bad with pop culture. In fact, it's embarrassing. My friends are ashamed of me. They're just like, don't speak when we're having this conversation. Just drink your cocktail, because you embarrass yourself, you embarrass us. So I usually don't speak on these things. So of course I had to ask, like, because he was the son of a rapper. And I said, so is his mom from Ghana? No. So what did I miss here? And that is just how it is. It's interchangeable. It's all the same. And it's a continent. Yeah. And lots of different people live there, not just our forebears, I should say.
Well, that's why I think it will be interesting to talk about in the context of Beyonce's film.
Yes, because I do talk about that as well. I want to talk about that. So great job, Abla. We're so in sync.
What a good pick. Thank you, George.
What a team.
Did Richard Pryor make a $80 million musical film about his trip to Africa, quote unquote?
Oh wait, yeah, Abla, sorry, I cut you off. So what happened when he went?
That's it. They didn't really talk about it. He just went and found himself and came back, and he developed this sort of vague interest in Africa and African culture and whatever that means. And I wish they'd spoken more about that and the link between this and his stand-up, or between this and his political activity. They glossed over that. There are some pictures of him with a beret looking like a Black Panther, but there wasn't much about that at all. So I don't really know where he stood.
Well, it could have been the context, because as we all know, in the 70s, Alex Haley's Roots was very popular. And I think it was a shift for a lot of people who were raised to be ashamed of not only slavery, but African heritage, and really focused on their white great-grandparent or fictitious Native American great-grandparent, right? Versus talking about the African one. So it was such a source of pride for people to begin to explore that. So maybe it was in that time where he thought, Alex Haley went, and I should go too. And Alex Haley, of course, encouraged other people, but let's not forget, although I don't want to underestimate the cultural significance of it, it was made up. And I still can't tell you to this day, when I meet people in London, they'll ask me if I've traced my roots. I'm like, no, that was made up. Have you traced yours? And they're like, why would I do that? Exactly. Oh, can't cope. But you go ahead. I'm so interested to hear what you have to say about that.
Well, on to our focus of the week, which is should I call it Beyonce's film, Black is King? Because I had to Google it. I didn't know what it was. So I will let George introduce it. But I'm not the audience for it also, because I did not watch The Lion King. I'm not the biggest Disney fan.
You didn't watch the cartoon?
I didn't watch any part of it. I just instinctively I resist
Hamlet,
that kind of film. So I would be curious to see what you both make of it.
Wait, you said you don't like that kind of film? What, because of the cartoon?
Well, I don't like Disney, but that will be an entirely different podcast as to my various reasons for not liking Disney, what they stand for and their practices, which are very dubious. On that note, what I'll do is, because there's an article that will sum up my opinion of Disney much, much more eloquently than I can. So I will leave a link to it for viewers to make up their own minds. But as a kid, I was very politicized, and already at about 6, I was very uncool, but about 6 or 7 years old, I already knew that Disney was not the sort of thing that I should be watching. And I was already put off by the talking animals. But as a kid, I was a bit of a snob. So I will let George introduce it, because it's your pick. Go for it.
Okay, well, Black is King is a feature-length musical, I suppose we can call it, a visual album for an album she released called The Gift, which was released in support of it's not really a live action remake, it's just a kind of photorealist animated updating of The Lion King that came out in 2019. Yeah, which is a film, which is an extremely kind of dead hollow exercise in cashing in on your own intellectual property. That film. The best thing about that film is probably the one original song taken from the Beyonce album, The Gift. So the Black is King, I'm not going to go into massive details about its plot and narrative, as it's quite an abstract narrative. It has it's loosely framed around The Lion King. I find it a very arbitrary narrative hook to hang on it. I think it's the weakest part of the film. It's, for those who've seen Lemonade, which is Beyonce's previous visual album, it's similarly kaleidoscopic in style, in tone. There's a huge amount of kind of visual information going on. It's massively symbolic. There's a constant switch up of different kind of film formats, different cameras being used, different directors, different cinematographers. I've heard it very reductively described as a series of music videos just stitched together by The Lion King, which I think is quite lazy critique of it. The least interesting thing about Black is King is probably its connection to The Lion King. It's in many ways quite a collaborative album. Oh, I mean, you've heard all the music now, because the music, a lot of artists, particularly from West Africa, were included on that album. So Black is King, the only connection to The Lion King is it retains those sound clips from the film. So when you hear someone going kind of, "Run away, Simba, and never come back," that's taken from the Disney Lion King remake. And I find those bits quite, they stick out and they feel quite awkwardly shoehorned in.
Yeah, because it didn't guide the story. It didn't match what was happening visually for me. So that's why I was a little confused. I wonder if it was just too abstract or if it was too avant-garde. I'm not sure why I didn't get it, but I could only get bits and pieces. Or if it's just because I'm not familiar with the symbolism from that region of the world, so I don't know. I
think if you took out that, because supposedly there's the framing narrative that connects the musical segments of the film, supposedly matches onto that basic core narrative in The Lion King. But I believe if you took out all the Lion King sound bites, you just wouldn't see that. I don't think anyone would instinctively say like, oh yes, of course this is a adaptation of The Lion King. So I think the connection is quite arbitrary, and I think it's a marketing thing, and it's the reason why Beyonce was given money by Disney to make the film. It is a avant-garde piece of sort of pop filmmaking. It is very abstract. It's so my interest in this film, and I picked this film before I'd seen it, so it's a sight unseen pick for us all to discuss. But Black is King is the only film this year that I've actually had in my diary for its release date. So excited was I.
Now, are you part of the Beehive, or why were you so excited?
I don't identify as a Beehive member. I mean, Beyonce's always been there, in the background. I've sort of grown. I remember being at school and Say My Name coming out.
Wow, you took it back.
So Destiny's Chance, that was there. And when Lemonade came out in 2016, I remember there being a fair bit of media attention to that. And I remember there being the film coming out. I didn't see it, but then I think I saw it in a few end of year best of lists. And then I started teaching a course where Lemonade is one of the films that we watch. So I ended up, I mean, by this point, I've now having taught that class for 3 years, I've now seen Lemonade nearly 10 times. Around this time, like personally, I was getting into like artist moving image. So when I started going to like artist moving image exhibitions and seeing work by people like Khalil Joseph, and then realizing that Khalil Joseph is an African-American filmmaker. He does a lot of gallery work, but he's worked with like Kendrick Lamar and other musicians as well. And he did the original cut of Lemonade, which then Beyonce wasn't. I think it was too. It was too avant-garde. Very few people have seen it. It's been screened in a few gallery spaces, and they don't really talk about it. So it's hard to say how much of his original Lemonade is in the finished version. But he is still listed as it's directed by Beyonce and Khalil Joseph. And then a bunch of other directors that she eventually brought on, including people like Melina Matsoukas, who went on to make Queen and Slim, which came out in February. And then I was writing at the time about some recent Terrence Malick films, and then realizing that Khalil Joseph has actually worked on some of those, and maybe the style, a very fragmented, particular visual style, he might have gleaned some of that from there, was then definitely popping up in in Lemonade, in Beyonce's film. And then just sort of finding it, really enjoying students' responses to it, because it's such similarly to Black is King, probably more so. It's a very overwhelming experience watching it, and you can't really recount everything you've seen. I'm sure if I asked Abla to give us a shot-by-shot breakdown of a particular moment, particular sequence in Black is King, you'd struggle. And then realizing that the poetry that Beyonce speaks in both Lemonade and Black is King is by the Somali British poet Wasson Shure, and it wasn't her own words. So I kept discovering more things about it. And I kept discovering more people involved in these projects who were just amazing artists or amazing writers, amazing filmmakers in their own right. And this kind of collaborative nature to make what is a very mainstream yet very avant-garde piece of work struck me as something quite unique. So when Beyonce, then she did Coachella, and the Netflix film Homecoming about that came out, I was fascinated again by this symbolic use of choreography and costuming to get these very, very dense, very dense tapestries, which reward the person who's interested in sort of researching and digging into these visual texts, which is like me. I like to go away and I like to sort of be given a project and to feel like there's a lot that I can do as a viewer to better understand what I'm seeing.
Right, so that's what drew you to it, really, the complexity of it and the things that you can unpick from just watching it a number of times.
And it's because there's just so much, and with Lemonade and with Black is King as well, there's all the I don't know much about fashion. I really don't know much about black hairstyles. And I'd been following the work of another experimental artist filmmaker, Jen Nkiru, who's a British Nigerian filmmaker who has worked with people like Arthur Jafer, who is probably my favorite filmmaker of the moment. He's another experimental filmmaker, but he was a cinematographer working for Spike Lee back in the 90s, and he was a cinematographer on Judi Dash's Daughters of the Dust, which is a big influence again for Beyonce. So Jen Nkiru then tweeted that she was working on. She announced that when the trailer for Black is King first came out, she said, "Yeah, here's this project I've been working on." And I was like, "Oh my god!" His again. Further, artists within the avant-garde sphere are again collaborating with this massively successful pop star, being given this opportunity to create work on a platform with money, with resources that are just unforeseen for these kinds of practitioners in years gone by and possibly years to come. This might be their only opportunity. Then finding out a bit more, realizing that the Ghanaian director Blitz Bazawule, he's also a musician, Blitz the Ambassador is his music name, who directed a film I really love called The Burial of Kojo, which is on Netflix. And I think Abla, you've seen Burial of Kojo.
Yeah, and I was interested to know what link you'd made between the two.
So Well, firstly, Burial of Kojo, which I do strongly recommend to any listeners who haven't seen it, and it's on Netflix. And although the film hasn't got like a massive amount of fanfare around it, I think the fact that it's a Ghanaian, Blitz Bazawule is a Ghanaian film director. Burial of Kojo was his first feature, and he does all the kind of framing segments in Black is King are directed by him.
Right.
So all the and I think he directed the Don't You Jealous Me section, which is where you've got Lord Afrixana with the big python on him, that early section in the film. So Burial of Kojo, I think pictorially there is a certain connection. He self-identifies as a kind of magical realist filmmaker. Burial of Kojo is a fairly simple story about a woman remembering as a young girl the death of her father in a legal mine in Ghana, but telling it as a kind of ghost story with trips into this kind of third realm where spirits reside, but told in style where nothing about that is particularly exceptional. That is just facts of life.
It reminded me of Atlantique, actually, and I thought it was interesting that it had... Did it come out the same year?
Yes, I think that's a fantastic comparison, actually, in the way... I mean, so Mati Diop's Atlantique's Senegalese, but has quite a similar approach to the sort of use of myth in that film, or the use of the idea of magic, or the idea of like the coexistence of spirits in the world, and that not being anything particularly surprising in both those films.
Translating the hardship that the characters go through, which
they go to see.
Yeah.
It's that, which is a really interesting turn of phrase. I was talking about Black is King with my friend, Ghanaian British poet Lebeja Kodua, who had just watched Atlantiques before we had this conversation a couple of days ago, and he spoke about like Atlantiques is definitely comparable to Burial of Kojo. Atlantiques and Burial of Kojo, I think, visually, certainly tonally very different to Black is King, but have certain visual motifs there. But he spoke of the idea of like going to see being so like loaded, so fraught with potential trauma, or it's a very uneasy statement in that film. And then being associated with now escape, but also incredible peril with the idea of being getting on a boat as a refugee or trying to go to Europe. I think they're trying to go to Spain in Atlantic. But Atlantique and Burial of Kojo they're probably not the most well-known films made in West Africa. They're not as sort of held up as films by Mati Diop's uncle, Djibril Diop Umberti, like Tuki Buki or Spoils Minsamben.
Well, funnily enough, I wanted to talk about African film as a way of comparing the impact that Black is King is meant to have, because we talk about its artistic aesthetic values and the complexity of the way it was put together and the collaboration of various very talented artists. I think where the issue is really, does it convey what it is meant to convey? Is it as empowering as the people behind it want it to be? And again, this is from a viewer's perspective, but I feel like, obviously now, because I've looked at his work a lot, but Ousmane Sembène's work comes to mind, that kind of filmmaking is much more empowering. And
well, I think it depends what kind of story you're trying to tell, right? Because to me, this is more about Black American imagination, like how Africa lives in the Black American imagination. Like even the title Black is King, would someone in Africa even refer to themselves as Black? No, like that's an American thing. And then we want other people to have that identity.
You see, I don't think there's that self-awareness there. I think if you read, I mean, again, this is because I've just read up on it, but the idea is very much to feel proud of your African roots and to depict the richness of Africa, the continent. And there's been a lot of criticism of that by Africans who were like, well, this doesn't actually reflect the issues on the ground.
Well, I think that's part of the issue, right? I mean, I think anything you look at that's presented in that way, and I've struggled with this trying to explain to non-American Black people my own evidence-based, not just opinion that's just sitting at home watching the news, but reading the research, right, by political scientists and sociologists around how we can contextualize and understand Black struggles in the U.S. is that in the media, it is as if slavery didn't happen. And I think I would agree with whatever criticism that you were talking about, Abla, because it does depict an Africa in which colonialism didn't happen. That's what you're looking at. So it is all very much a fantasy, which I don't think is a problem. It's only a problem when people take that to be real.
One thing that a lot of people applauded the film for doing, which is that it gives not just Black people, but Black women pride in their appearance.
Allegedly. Come on now. Okay. It's Beyonce. Can we start there? How much does Beyonce, and don't get me wrong, like, of course, Beyonce is beautiful. Everyone can agree on that. At the same time, just like anyone that's celebrated for their beauty, it's by definition not average, right? So she's not a typical Black woman. It's not her job to be, though, and I remember the song, yes, about dark-skinned girls, and she brought in her old Destiny Child's, and I'm sure they're still best friends, right, to sing to her about being beautiful and, to her daughter's kinky hair and coils. Yes, 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 yes. To me, I don't know if I've always found that to be a problem. And of course, I'm speaking as a dark-skinned woman, and I now had to stop getting a relaxer because I could not find, well, let me not say that. I don't want to say anything inflammatory. But ultimately, I did have to start wearing my hair natural. And I straighten it all the time, as Abla can attest to. I don't think she's ever seen my hair natural. I'm always straightening it with, just flat iron or whatever. But I don't think that we should put that kind of... I don't think we should value ourselves as women in our...
But it's not beauty. It's physical features.
I think... oh, come on. It's beauty. We all know. We've all seen Beauty and the Beast. I know you hate Disney, but yes, real beauty's on the inside. Okay, but if we're going to be real beauty in appearance, how you look, I don't want us to have our self-esteem from that. Like, I want our self-esteem to come from somewhere else. I shouldn't have value as a woman because you think I'm beautiful or attractive or I'm somehow sexually enticing you. And of course, as a woman, you want to do those things. Mm-hmm. I think we have a disproportionate amount of value on that. And even messaging I've seen, and of course, everything's got to have balance, right? So you want to have some of that. But even the things I've seen with affirming our cute chocolate girls, it's all about telling them how pretty they are. It's like, well, why not tell them what a great daughter they are, or what a great sister they are, or what about a friend they are, or how much they help you, talking about their behaviors and the values that they have that are expressed in their actions or how they make other people feel, or even just the things they do to keep the household running. Like, I love that I never have to nag you about doing your chores. And it sounds silly, but ultimately, then what do you do? I think that's why some people then have a breakdown. In fact, my friend just sent me one of her friend is putting together a film, and it was all about that, the anger and resentment of not being desired as a dark-skinned woman. I just can't take it. Like, that can't be the source of your pain. And I think it also takes away from, the political work that we need to do, because that's the real source. So anytime you look at it as, oh, well, it's because someone isn't affirming me, that's when they've got you. They want your attention there so that you don't have to dig deeper to say where the real source of that is, which is in kind of like a race, systemic racism, white supremacy. That should be your focus, which isn't to say, like I said, beauty is important. Like, it's fine. Like, I love to go to the MAC counter and to get my makeup done because I cannot do it myself like a child. What I'm saying, the message was lost on me because my family is super, I was definitely raised to do that. I'm just thinking when we're telling a broader story about that, it's like, and they were all sexy. She didn't have any ugly dark-skinned women on there, so stop it. Just stop. They were all gorgeous, all looking fly. Even Lupita had her dance going. It's like, I've never seen her dance like that. They were just as sexy as they wanted to be, talking about just enough. So no, I would prefer another song about.
I agree, but that's sort of what I was going to say. I mean, that's what it was lauded for doing, which was trying to convince legions of women and girls to leave aside the bleaching creams and the straighteners and so on.
Oh, I forgot in that context. I forgot they still do that there because that's not.
They do the bleaching creams. All over the world, Arab world, they still do. Weirdly enough, as I said last time, I mean, I always thought of myself as white other, I guess, is what I tend to tick on the little boxes here. But I'm Middle Eastern, I have curly hair and I'm very hairy. And the hair issue I really got pissed off about because I used to straighten my hair when I was 10. Every time I washed my hair, my mum had to sit there blow drying it for ages. I really hated having curly hair. I tried to bleach it. I put this sun spray thing in and it turned it ginger for some reason. And anyway, so for me, this resonated to some extent.
Well, we know colorism has been addressed in other places, right? I mean, I was watching some campaign and they started off, it was a documentary, and they started off talking about how the mica, the little children are mining it, and somehow it turned into the children then being able to go to school and form an organization to tackle colorism. I didn't get where that leap came from. It's like, so the kids aren't going to get their parents better jobs. Fantastic.
But that's exactly it. So I thought, well, it addressed that. So none of it addressed, well, what's systemic about this whole thing? And this is why immediately I thought of the films that George brought up that were empowering in the sense that they had main characters that were women. I mean, I refer to Black Girl, for example, which is available to watch on YouTube, and that's an Usman Sambene film. And what I absolutely loved about it was about how sarcastic she was, how intelligent she was, and how much she was taken advantage of by this French family that she'd gone over to work for. None of it was about her looks, none of it was about the aesthetics of Africa. And even his more symbolic films, I mean, George can back me up on this, but what am I thinking of?
Jala, or is it Mulade?
Mulade, yeah. It's very symbolic. There's a lot of it that's very abstract. There's a lot of it that's rooted in myth and in legends and in local folklore and so on. But it really works as a piece of satire, as a piece of critique. It addresses fundamental issues of socioeconomic origin on the ground. And where I felt that Black is King, it was very much like a music video that's not essentially trying to do much more than that, even though it pretends it does. And ultimately, and that's my biggest issue with it, which I thought was echoed quite well in, of all places, an article in Teen Vogue by an author called, he's a music reviewer, Timo Tepaku, who, and I quote him, the expectation that through a project created for the notoriously conservative Disney, ! She would somehow engage in an in-depth dissection of the oppressive intersections of capitalism, patriarchy, heteronormativity, and anti-blackness might be too much to ask. And ultimately, that's the problem. It's Beyonce as an artist whose entire career is rooted in that system. And that's what's reflected in this. To be honest, she's not much of a hypocrite because the whole premise of it is that we should be proud of our origins because they are rooted in royalty, they are rooted in aristocracy. And the sense that she brings to it is that this pride is found in opulence and bling and extravagance.
I use that same word, opulence. Let's talk about that because that was one of my issues as well. Because I think it's a dangerous myth that we don't think is dangerous enough. So there is certainly a term, right? Like we call each other kings and queens, which I think is fine, just as if you address someone as madam or sir, even though they actually aren't. But it's a way of showing respect. And I think it's great that we use terms that find ways to uplift and respect each other and affirm who we are. I think that's wonderful. It then becomes a problem, though, when we think we are actual royalty. Now, of course, we know the common saying, right? That what is it that all commoners have nobility in their background and vice versa. Unfortunately, there seems to be this real thing that, no, we actually were. It's like, well, if you were sold off, it's likely that the king or queen sold you off, which is why your ancestors ended up as slaves in America. You get where I'm going? And I just think it's bizarre that we don't want to accept that sort of truth, because I think it's a complicated relationship to West Africa. I mean, there's the obvious that we're descended from West Africans, right? We only need a mirror for that. However, I don't think we want to get honest about the slave trade and how that happened. And if you listen to actual reputable historians from Ghana or Nigeria, they'll be very clear about the different stages of slavery where, yes, at one point people were being taken, but ultimately they were sold. And ultimately people were fine to do that to keep their kingdoms propped up by European powers, in certain stages of colonialism. And I think we just have to be honest and say, well, let's tell the truth about how you were marched from the Congo to the coast, because that's just the reality of it. And it certainly doesn't mean that you shouldn't have pride in the sort of cultural traditions and heritage, but you'd have to dig for them because they only exist in a sort of hybrid form at this point, right? In terms of also being influenced by European culture. We speak English and we're Christians for the most part. And the same for, I'd say American culture in general, right? Like it's obviously heavily influenced by West African culture, even though there's only credit given to English heritage, right? And German heritage. So of course that can go around. But if we're speaking specifically about Black people, I think it is that's why it certainly watching it conjured up like our fantasies of the continent. And I wish more Black people would go. But of course, being a group with no wealth, we can't really afford that. But for the ones who can afford to travel, I would encourage and pick a country to go to. Actually, I met this woman one time and she called me a dream killer because she said that she was going to get a DNA test and go to the country where her DNA was from. And I laughed. But I didn't really take her seriously until she stopped and said, "What's so funny?" I said, "Wait, you're serious about that?" And I had to explain to her that there is, and that's another thing too, people believe in this sort of biological race that you carry in your DNA and then you can find out where you're from. And of course, she was from the Caribbean, so I'm sure she's from a few different West African groups, right? And although, of course, we know European, but she doesn't want to trace that one, but we won't go there. What I did say, though, is just pick a country and go to it. I mean, but the narrative is you have to go to find out who you really are. No one says it to Afro-Mexicans. No one says it to Brazilians. It's just us who, 12, 15 generations on. It's like, no, you need to figure that out. So I think it is then, instead of accepting that historical truth and then going to see the continent wherever you choose to go as it exists today, and then understanding that in its context, we do a Coming to America motif. And I love Coming to America. And there's the sequel coming out in December, which I'm sure I'll be dragging Abla to. Oh, yes.
Really?
We're going to that.
Oh, cool.
I've already bought my shirt to wear. I got a McDowell's t-shirt.
Same cast?
Well, I think
a lot. Yeah.
Again, like, I like it because it's fun. I certainly don't think it says anything about African royalty as it exists today. It's absurd. But there is this, like you're saying, this sort of emphasis on opulence. And I think I'm more disappointed because as a Black American, we understand that that sort of opulence was built on our backs. So how can you, on the one hand, say, like, we come from the slavery that allowed the primitive accumulation of capital that puts us where we are today, and then we celebrate it? Like, why does that make you happy if a Black person is doing that versus a European or a white American?
Because they're American. Because before being Black, ultimately, they're American. They grew up in America.
Yes,
and they espouse American values.
And we do have American values, absolutely. So then to export that, though, right? And even looking at, like, visually that whole Coming to America scene, it was even the way they had the servants. They objectified the servants, the descendants of slaves, for God's sakes, having African with, like, these just like statues. And it's like they added something to the landscape from the styling and the textures, like in the library scene. It was all very beautiful. But then when you think, like, why would you have the people engaging in that way, given what our ancestry is? I wasn't quite sure about that. So, I mean, it wasn't derogatory. I just think that sort of, it was presented as authentic when in truth, this is how the ultra elite lives, because we all know that there are people who live that sort of opulent lifestyles. We say they come to Europe for the weekend for these extended shopping trips. We all know about that, but that is the ultra elite. That is the aristocracy. Yeah. That is now what you see in many countries, this, polarization of wealth is extreme. But like you said, I don't think that was really her point to do this. Even so, if we think about the title, right, Black is King, I think it was culture and it had to be a superficial way, because if you're talking about all 1 billion people of African heritage in the diaspora, there's no way you could do that in an hour, let alone visually what that would even look like. You have to be pretty selective.
Well, that's why I brought up Sembene. I mean, films like Muladi, because they do that. They manage to speak about so much. Talking about colonialism, he's talking about oppression, he's talking about everything's in there, and it's a really angry but very also quite funny critique of an entire system that he manages to do. And my concern is, as a music video, as a piece of art, as what I guess a concept album, that really works. It's just reading between the lines, or not even, but basically reading that her ambition is to present herself as this figurehead for the whole of whatever X generation African Americans.
Well, you know what's interesting too is that there is no touch on the history of Black Americans in the continent. So like our history in Liberia and Sierra Leone, that's never touched on. Because of course, the kind of common sense thing, given, you know, the kind of abolitionist discourse on repatriation, I think you see those same themes coming through today when people talk about going back, quote unquote, home. And it's interesting that they don't choose those two places. It's like, why not? That's where you went and caused trouble 100 years ago. Go on back there then, since you want to go. So, and that's when you kind of have to disentangle what are people really saying, what are they really after. So I think that's still a question. But George, didn't you have some questions in Abla? I don't think you asked questions. Okay.
Well, I was really enjoying this discussion, listening. But I want maybe to slightly defend, like, no film can probably satisfy all of those things you're talking. I mean, the film is from the start. Its starting point is overly ambitious anyway. So the idea of Africa, and then you can't cover Africa in the film. There is no such thing as Africa. Just like an amalgamous blob is there. So, but I mean, Beyonce is not as well positioned as Sembene was in his late career to make a serious like political engagement with, say, with Sembene would be Senegal. I mean, it's always going to be an outsider's view, no matter how much continental talent she's working with, I think. But perhaps if we see it, I mean, I think we can say this is a work of like Afrofuturism. It might be deliberately shying away. It's like sort of James Baldwin criticizing Native Son, saying like, why do we have to see black pain? Or even like Bell Hooks talking about how much he hates 12 Years a Slave. Like, why do you have to show me that? So, I mean, Afrofuturism to be so utopic, I suppose, is the idea associated with that genre.
I don't know. They had a house full of servants, so utopia for who? And I think that's my question. That's like the main critique, because there are lots of scenes like the guy going out to partying, the wedding scene. They weren't so opulent, so I think it was those specifically.
I mean, I do find that's Mood Forever, the scene you've been talking about. I mean, I think it not explicitly, but is fairly ironic. You've got them having their TV dinner with their champagne and these like Busby Berkeley sequences, but with black synchronized swimmers and her basically winking at the camera at the end. But I think with Beyonce, there is sort of no getting away from that critique of her as a business person, her as a massive cash generator. Although, as I said at the start, you know, the fact that Beyonce is attached to this has allowed all of these creative people to have some access to the cash. But with Afrofuturism, and I'm thinking to quote LaBeija Kodjo again, so he, before the film came out, his main concern was, so he really strongly dislikes when particularly American or British as well, black creators, artists superficially use African aesthetics, or, you know, have some kente cloth on because they think it looks cool without really understanding that. So his issue is always, where does Afrofuturism cross the line into Afrofetishism? And perhaps the American making this kind of Afrofuturist work about Africa can never really escape Afrofetishism, no matter how well researched it is. Khalil Joseph, believed to be Beyonce's big inspiration, aesthetic inspiration, said he's much more interested in felt experience as opposed to lived experience. So there might be something in that she's not so concerned with showing a kind of how actually it is. But in that sense that she wants to evoke mood rather than have a really strong really engage you strongly on an intellectual, and she's not trying to raise your political consciousness, she's trying to raise some kind of emotional state here.
I think you're right. To some extent it's successful, and it definitely will appeal to a lot of people in exactly the way you explained. So I'm sure a lot of people, many people who'll be watching it, will think it's just really cool. It's empowering in the sense that it makes you feel like there's this very rich, very cool, very colourful heritage that's yours to take and to be proud of and to show off. So in that sense, I'm sure it's very successful. I wish personally that it was, but again, that's not, I guess, Beyonce's role. But then is she presenting herself in that role? I don't know. But I wish it was presenting a more, and I don't mean at all presenting like misery porn or whatever, but presenting another, say, slightly surreal utopian vision of people finding power in other ways, in solidarity. The problem is power in that film was embedded in wealth and in opulence.
I read quite an interesting interview with Blitz Bazawule, it's very Okujo and this, but he was asked about that. So, because Gary Okujo is against kind of fraudulent capitalist processes. Yeah, so he was asked directly, like, do you not think that sits quite uneasily? And he kind of brushed off the question, but he did. What I think was the interesting thing is he says, like, okay, but like Burial Okojo, just by being on Netflix, probably Atlantiques have probably been watched more times than like Black Girl by Somebody has ever been watched, by the way. I would guess. Exactly, yeah. So those kinds of films, he says, like, this is the start of a new life for African cinema. So he talks about the actual utopia being that something like Black is King, which now feels like the one big film that everyone's watching that's about Africa, is one day just going to be a kind of little footnote in the start of this new production cycle where, at least hopefully like Bazawule is going to get some more money from Netflix to go make a film. No, probably end up just making like Black Panther 3 down the line, but maybe that's fine. Or like, Jen and Curry is going to get more commissions. So
it's the platform it gives to these artists.
The platform and it's, time, it's something to look back on, but like the opportunities, and is the legacy going to be that these African creators, African filmmakers and writers who can really write and direct films about the African experience in a way that is so much more politically and culturally connected authentically. I think that would be the true, if that comes to be the case, then that means that Black is King was completely worth it.
But I think those are two different questions, right? Like, I think it's two different questions. Like, on the one hand, we're talking about individuals like stylists, directors, vocalists, creatives, filmmakers on the continent who will now be given opportunities. Like, that is 100% going to happen, right? And so all these artists will be able to hopefully leverage into contracts and concerts, maybe even promotional deals. Impact-wise, it's still about what's able to be made. So before, like George was talking about Bell Hooks saying like she didn't understand why 12 Years a Slave need to be made. I actually like that film, and I think it did need to be made because I actually don't think people do understand slavery. So not only do people not understand slavery, but people don't understand how we live with the consequences of slavery. And that second part isn't shown. So I think considering in the US what kind of Black life is shown on television, you can't even get authentic Black life on television, right? So that doesn't exist where we have a show that shows a regular family where the mom's a school teacher, the dad's a truck driver. You don't see that anymore. So certainly I don't know if that is going to create the space for that kind of filmmaking to show authentic African life by African storytellers and African filmmakers. I'm not sure about that, but who knows? Like, opportunities come about and people can push the envelope. But I think it's, to me, more what it speaks to, and it is specifically the opulence, because not all the scenes had that. Like the introductory scene, even though my mom didn't like it, my mom thought my mom said, "Who walks like that with a baby?" She thought it was a little too much, and she thought it was disrespectful to the people. She said, "Is she supposed to be representing an African woman? Because I can't see her doing that with a baby." So the wedding scene, which I think was my favorite. So there were ways to do that without, I think, going into this fantasy that I think you see continuous throughout the, how Africa is represented in U.S. media. And I think that's the bigger question about who gets to be in charge of that story. And I think it is all about kind of what role that group plays in the society, right? So how is it that the general public wants to see Black people depicted? And I think we're at a stage now in the U.S. where, like bell hooks, and that's why I think I would disagree with that comment. It's like, well, we don't want to see the struggle anymore. We want to see people doing well. But it's like, okay, well, if there's only 5 of you doing well, is that really what you want to tell? And we have said, yes, that is what we want, because that makes us feel better and that builds our self-esteem. Perhaps, but then when do we ever get to the story that helps us better understand our material conditions? Which, like you're saying, of course, that's not the job of this
Yeah, but it's not
video.
Beyonce that's going to do that.
Yeah, and it's not her job to do that. But I also think in terms of the legacy, though, I think that it could just open the door to more of that, more fetishism, where what we want to see from Africa in terms of their films is we want to see people being happy and doing wonderfully colorful, creative, beautiful things, and only pretty people allowed, right? Because this is Hollywood. Just to say one other thing that came to mind, I don't know if it's so much of a conclusion, is also, I think, even the legacy of West Africa is complicated, because I remember I took a class, only one, it's really sad, but I only took one class on African history, and he talked about that. The historiography is complicated because a lot of their myths through colonialism, right, they were infused with Western Christianity. So even though they think a lot of the stories are authentic, they really aren't, because they changed them in order to fit that. So I think that even though people talk about it as if you can trace it back hundreds of years, I don't think that's necessarily true either. And there's nothing wrong with that, because culture changes, right? And you get different influences. But I think that should also be recognized, and maybe people, think about culture in a more complex way, nothing that is pure, unadulterated, and that's the only place you can go to find it to be your true self. So I would say that I think outside of the luxury, if we're just imagining, of course, everything was beautifully shot, everything was beautifully done. And as you pointed out, George, there will be opportunities for people that would not have otherwise been there. So to amplify those voices, I think, to me, is the best thing that superstars and icons can do for others. So I think that was positive. And of course, everything was beautiful. It's just, I think there was a sort of dangerous myth of one cherry picking ancestors and only caring about the ones that were regal and royal, and believing that authenticity lies somewhere on the continent.
Nicely said. Right, George, your conclusion?
As a kind of conversation piece, I think it's really valuable. Yeah, I think just to go back to like this kind of tension between the fantasy or the reality or like the utopia or the real like dystopian elements of like the African experience. That Bell Hooks interview I quoted from was an interview she did with Arthur Jafer, and really maybe if you can find Arthur Jafer's film Love is the Message is Death. It's a 7-minute short film. It is something that incorporates both images of pain and joy and Black American experience. It is perhaps in a similar kind of kaleidoscopic collage style that you could relate to something like Black is King in terms of style, but content-wise, it is much more plugged into a socio-political moment. Arthur Jafer talks about to understand an image, you have to understand it in context. You have to put an image before and after it. And you may forget 2 of those images, but the third image you will understand. And those 2 images you forgot, they helped inform your experience of this other image. So if people watch Black is King, I hope they look into the work done by other people associated with it, some of the collaborators that are making much less visible but really important work, really amazing work, and try and find a copy of Love is a Message, The Message of Death by Arthur Jafer for a slight tonic to some of the ways in which Black is King might be fallible.
Thanks, George, for joining us. This was the Mydylarama podcast. You can tweet us your comments and feedback at Mydylarama, and check out our website, mydylarama.org.uk. All details will be in the blurb. And see you next time.